So the 90s were kind of a crazy time when it came to the arcade scene. In many ways, that era was the arcade's last hurrah. I mean, sure, arcades are still a thing, but in the current era, usually arcades are more of a Dave and Buster's type experience, where it's a whole entertainment complex that has places for you to eat, sometimes drink, and then go waste money on the crane machines. Because nothing is better than spending 40 bucks on a plush South Park toy that probably would normally only cost $5. True story, I actually only spent $1 or $2 on this because one of the local Bolero bowling alleys has a giant crane machine filled with items this size, and I managed to just randomly grab it in one play right before we walked out. Because I need a giant Cartman laying around my house. Anyway, in the 90s, a bulk of the arcade business still centered around actual video game cabinets and pinball machines. Of course, plenty of those machines belonged to Japanese companies, Sega for one, Capcom, SNK, Taito, Namco, etc., etc. But there was also one very American company out there that was attempting, and succeeding, at competing with those other titans with massive arcade hits like Mortal Kombat and NBA Jam. Although, depending on when and what type of arcade machines you played, you might not have known that it was just one company due to the way the machines were branded. That company was WMS Industries Incorporated, aka Williams Electronics Incorporated, which was headquartered in good old Chicago, Illinois. Williams, as I'm referring to it here, got its start in 1974. However, if you want to get really technical, the roots of the company go all the way back to 1943. So you're not crazy. That old solid-state pinball machine that you saw from the 50s or 60s with their name on it was real. Or, I mean, it could have been real. Who am I to judge if you're hallucinating or not? However, I should probably pause for a second because I'm sure that there's some of you out there that don't know me and now are questioning whether you really saw that pinball machine or not. And if you're not, maybe you should be. Hi, my name is Dave, and welcome to Zilog and Moto, the channel where I assure you that that Shangri-La machine isn't real, it can't hurt you. Or can it? Anyway, I'm out to collect and review the nearly 1,280 titles released in the English language for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega or Mega CD as the case may be, and finally the 32X. Basically, if I can plug it into a Genesis, either by itself or with some sort of add-on, and be able to read what's up on the screen, I'm trying to get a copy of it and review it for posterity, with both looks at that original packaging and gameplay captured from original hardware whenever possible. Phantom pinball machine silliness aside, if you're from Europe, this intro might be very confusing. The reason for that is because this week's game, Williams Arcade's Greatest Hits, doesn't exist there. Instead, the game that was released was Midway Arcade's Greatest Hits. Why is that? Well, it goes back to what I was saying before. In the mid-90s, Williams wasn't just Williams, it also owned Bally Midway. So any machine with Bally or Midway branding, yeah, that was technically Williams, just under a different name. Without getting too into the weeds with who did what, in 1996, with all the recent success that Midway branded machines had in the arcades, Williams decided to spin them off as their own company, which is how a game called Williams Arcade's Greatest Hits, when it was originally released in September of 1996, became Midway Arcade's Greatest Hits when it subsequently appeared in Europe. But what exactly is Williams or Midway Arcade's Greatest Hits? What games are included here? And the most important question, is a game released this late into a console's lifespan going to be any good, or was it just shovelware designed to fill out the dwindling Genesis presence on retail shelves? We'll look at all that and more, but first a look at the package. And here's my copy of Williams Arcade's Greatest Hits for the Genesis. And unlike last week's review of Buggy Run, there's no particular special story here. I just happened to pick the game up at some point. And I don't recall spending a whole lot for it either, which makes sense because not only did I happen to see a copy of it at the local disc replay this week for $16.99, current listings on price charting having it going for similar prices of between $15 to $20. With this being a very late release on the console, as you might expect, it's in a cardboard box, as was standard at the time. Thankfully, this copy has been well maintained on the inside as well as the outside, with really only some minor squashing to the inner tray and a few marks on the outer cover if you look really close. But other than that, no sun bleaching, water damage, or excessive wear to anywhere,
so this one is definitely a keeper for me. As far as the front cover goes, there's nothing too special here, but that's okay, sometimes simple works. I like the silver Williams logo at the top with the Arcade's Greatest Hits in stylized block silver. Kind of reminds me of how the HBO logo looked back in the day. And if you're watching this in 20 years and you don't know what HBO is, well, HBO is what Max was called previously because the owners decided that somehow a different 3-letter name was better branding than the 3-letter name that they already had for 40 years. The rest of the cover consists of logos of each of the 5 games that are included in the package, each in their own window that resembles a TV. If I had one complaint about the cover, it's that due to that stylizing, the logos for the games are actually pretty small, and you might not be able to tell what Robotron or Sinistar are right away. As far as the European version goes, it's basically the same cover, but as mentioned with the Midway logo at the top instead of Williams. Flipping over the rear cover, it feels like there's an awful lot of wasted space, with everything being crammed into the top 2/3 of the box, and that's kind of a problem when you're dealing with screenshots from games that are all known for having black backgrounds. These games were already going to have problems standing out due to that, and now they're fairly small pictures as well, but at least they managed to include all 5. What probably would have been a better approach, considering that this game came out about 15 years after the heyday of all these titles in the arcades, would have been to try to arrange the screenshots in relation to the marquee artwork for the game that's over by the side, so that people would at least know what they're looking at. I mean, I know what each of these games are, although Defender vs. Defender 2 is a little tricky, but is a kid that possibly has never ever seen these machines going to know what they're looking at? The flavor text is patently awful too. For example, once again, work out on Defender. What does that even mean? Work out? Is Defender some new resistance machine at LA Fitness? And then a few lines down, they don't even get the name of Robotron 2084 correct, instead calling it Robotron 2004. Opening up the box, and the insides are pristine. The cartridge tray isn't torn to shreds, and the cartridge manual and warranty card are more or less untouched. Note for collectors, apparently there's 2 versions of this, one that has a manual with a traditional glossy color cover, and then there's this even more budget-conscious version that's all black and white. Regardless of whichever cover your manual happens to have, though, there's not a whole lot here, with the manual barely being better cared for than the rest of the package. Most of the manual is dedicated to showing controller diagrams for each of the games, which is a nice baseline, but where's the portion that explains what all of the options in the various options screen mean? And I know that arcade games in the early 80s were relatively simple, but couldn't you do a page on each one that explains what's going on in the game and what you're actually supposed to be doing with said controls? Arcade games from this era had a lot of that information built into various attract screens, and those are included, but it would have really been helpful to have it laid out here instead. Anyway, that's the somewhat lackluster package. Let's get into the game and see if these ports have been treated with a little more respect. The story of Williams Arcade's Greatest Hits actually begins in 1995, about a year before the cartridge was released for the Genesis. Oh, okay, fine. Technically it begins in 1980 when Defender was first released in the arcades, but I'll get to that in a moment. Anyway, Williams Arcade's Greatest Hits actually began life on the PC, with releases for Windows and DOS named Williams Arcade Classics. That version of the game, also developed by Digital Eclipse, includes 6 games: Defender, Defender 2 aka Stargate, Joust, Robotron 2084, Sinistar, and a game called Bubbles. Personally, I had never heard of Bubbles before working on this review, and I'm pretty certain I've never seen a Bubbles machine, but supposedly they do have it at the trusty Galloping Ghost arcade, so maybe I just need to keep an eye out for it the next time I'm in there. Anyway, the point is, it's a pretty obscure title, and its inclusion into the collection is a bit questionable, but I suppose I could see adding it to get some variety. From watching video of Bubbles, it doesn't seem like a bad game, but the only thing that seems notable about it is how some of the gameplay elements could have possibly been an early inspiration for the Katamari Damacy series. Williams Arcade Classics must have sold well enough for the PC, because the decision was made by Williams to bring back Digital Eclipse and expand to the console market, creating what has now been renamed Williams Arcade's Greatest Hits for both the Genesis and the Super Nintendo. However, as you probably noticed from the previous box section, there's no Bubbles here. Why Bubbles was excluded for the console version is unclear, but it appears to have possibly been a cost-saving measure, as the title is crammed onto a tiny 4 megabit cartridge, and I'm guessing there just wasn't room there for a 6th game, so Bubbles, being the least well-known of the 6 games, got the boot. This would all make perfect sense if Williams Arcade's Greatest Hits came out in, say, 1991, but keep in mind it was late 1996 at this point. You mean to tell me they couldn't spring for a larger than 4 megabit cartridge? To add insult to injury, 32-bit versions of the game for the PlayStation, Saturn, and Dreamcast all brought Bubbles back to the fold, so in that respect, the decision to not include it on the Genesis and Super Nintendo looks a bit worse in comparison. But I've spent far too long talking about a game that's not included here, so let's move on. As far as the games that are here, let's start with Defender, seeing as how it's the oldest of the bunch, and it's the game that I have the most experience with out of the 5 titles. Well, sort of. I say that because while I'm not sure if I've ever actually played the arcade version of Defender before this week, what I have played extensively is the Atari 2600 version, which I had as a kid. I remembered enjoying it, flying around, blowing up alien spaceships, and trying to save humans before they fall to their doom. It made for a decent game. Playing the game on the Genesis all these years later illustrated a few things to me. The first thing I realized is that the Atari 2600 version did a solid job of approximating the action onto much less powerful hardware. But now playing the arcade version makes me realize how much more impressive it was. Zooming around in your Defender ship felt like all it did those years ago on the 2600, but also better, as playing the game made me realize the little nuances that the 2600 couldn't handle. After playing it for a bit, I realized something that probably should have been a duh concept to a Sega fan, but I actually never thought about it before, mainly because it had been so long since I'd actually played Defender. If you've been watching gameplay, you probably have already picked up on this, but Defender is clearly the inspiration for the Fantasy Zone series. I haven't covered any of the Fantasy Zone titles so far on the channel, due to the fact that they're surprisingly hard to find, but anyone that's played them, or perhaps the ports in the Yakuza series, will immediately know what I'm talking about here. Aside from just the basic gameplay structure, just like in Fantasy Zone, Defender is hard, but it's that kind of tricky difficulty in that the game is simple in concept, but if you're not careful, you'll be quickly looking at a game over screen. Now, granted, one of the things about this collection is that for each of the games, you can adjust various settings before going into the game, if you happen to think that it's too easy or too difficult. And that's nice if you want to mix things up a bit, but for my purposes, in this review, I wanted to stick as close to the arcade experience as possible, so for all the games, I left everything at default. Next on the list is Defender 2, aka Stargate. If you saw this game in the arcades, you probably saw it as Stargate, so as the name change to Defender 2 was mainly for home ports. But honestly, calling it Defender 2 makes total sense because the game is basically Defender on steroids. There's more of everything, more enemies, more chaos on the screen, more control options, that I'll discuss more in a bit, but at its core, you're still doing the same basic thing, trying to defend the planet from invading aliens, and stop the humanoids from being abducted. Ultimately, while I like Defender, I do think I prefer Defender 2, as it feels like the gameplay has been tweaked slightly so it's a bit less frustrating. And so it's not just adding a bunch of new features, the developers really did try to make a better game. Next on the list is Joust. Joust is another game like Defender that I had previous experience with, but in the case of Joust, it's a game that I specifically had played the arcade version. Joust is probably the simplest of all the games in the list, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes all you need is a joystick and a button. Playing the game now on the Genesis completely brought me back to playing the arcade game, and it's a perfect representation of that arcade experience, complete with wishing the game had a rapid fire option to help you in controlling your ostrich, or stork apparently if you're playing in 2-player mode. Just like all these other games, it's totally got that, okay, we're going to start you out easy and then ramp things up quickly, which of course worked in the arcades to motivate players to continue to drop quarters into the machine for players to try again. But one thing unexpected happened while I was playing the game, and much like how it finally dawned on me that Defender begat Fantasy Zone, I realized that without Joust, we wouldn't have Mario Brothers. And yes, while sure there's differences between the games, think about it. Both games are based around a multi-platform wraparound arena, both games hinge on being able to control your character's momentum, and both games require you to fully dispose of enemies. In Mario Brothers, after you attack an enemy from above, you have to make sure to knock the enemy off the screen. In Joust, after you attack an enemy from above, you have to collect the egg that you've dislodged from your enemy. And in both cases, if you don't, an enemy will come back even faster and try to kill you. So, next time you want to mess with a Nintendo fan, tell them that Mario Brothers wouldn't exist without Williams, and watch their head explode. The next game on the list is probably my favorite of all 5 titles, and that's Robotron 2084. Robotron 2084 is the originator of the twin-stick style of arcade shooters that you might be more familiar with in the form of Smash TV, its sequel Tonal Carnage, or its spiritual successor that I covered back in episode 48, Xenocrisis. Essentially, your job is to try to protect the last human family against an army of Robotrons. But if we're being honest, the game is all about chaos, with a wild assortment of colors and explosions that probably should have an epilepsy warning. And I don't mean to joke about epilepsy there, I really mean that this game could be particularly flashy, especially for the era. Like Joust, it's a simple game, but this time around, you're just trying to navigate around the screen, destroying everything you can without dying yourself in an attempt to make it to the next level. But it's not as simple as just destroying everything, because there are enemies and humans that you can't destroy, and there's enemies that spawn other enemies that need to be targeted before you get overcome. Out of all the games in the list, this one gives that feeling of just one more game to try to get a higher score more than any other. Finally, like Defender 2/Stargate, it's the other game that I had never played before this week, and that's Sinistar. I had heard of Sinistar just from seeing other people mention it on the internet, but for whatever reason I had never played it in the arcades just due to its age, and it also wasn't ported to home consoles or computers until the 90s. The reason for that, I'm assuming, is the same reason why I've seen it discussed on the internet, and that's due to its freakish digital speech, which has apparently frightened many a player. Keep in mind that Sinistar first appeared in early 1983, which makes it the most recent of any of these games, but even then, video games simply didn't talk to players. This is well before Gauntlet's "Wizard needs food badly," or Impossible Mission's "Destroy him, robots." And not only was Sinistar first, but it is creepy, with Sinistar taunting the player, calling you cowards, and telling you to run away. As a game, it really is just asteroids with a twist, but man, what a twist, and I definitely could never go back to playing just asteroids after tangling with Sinistar. Now that I've gone over all 5 of the games, here's probably the most important question about this release. Just how good are these ports? Was Digital Eclipse able to pull off arcade perfection, or similar to the packaging and limited cartridge size, is this a shoddy set of ports designed to make a quick buck off of kids that still owned a Genesis in late 1996? Well, thankfully, I can say that each of the games is presented nearly perfectly, and is a replica of the arcade original, with the addition of the ability to set various gameplay options before playing, that would have been most likely covered by dip switches in the original arcade cabinet. From a graphics and sound perspective, you're going to have to be looking incredibly close to tell the difference, and I even compared this release to how the games were presented on in the later Midway arcade origins for Xbox 360, and the only real difference in graphics and sound was the game being displayed at a higher resolution due to being on a modern console. I did say nearly perfect there though, so of course I'm going to be slightly picky for a minute. There are 2 things about this release that annoy me a bit, and no, neither one is the exclusion of Bubbles. Although, for all of the 2 Bubbles fans out there that are watching, I could see that being a deal breaker. No, the 2 things I have issue with come down to controls and scoring. To be clear, I think the game on the whole controls excellently. Even probably the trickiest game of the lot to get correct, Robotron 2084, has an option to be able to use 6-button controllers and allows you to use the buttons to replicate the shooting actions on the missing right stick, which Bitmap Bureau adopted for Xenocrisis as well. The problem is how the game handles 6-button controller support, which affects both Robotron 2084 and Defender 2, as both have 6-button setups. Unlike other games on the console, where the controller defaults to 6-button mode when the console is turned on, unless you hold in the mode button, the game instead defaults to 3-button mode, and you have to hit the mode button to switch into 6-button mode every single time you start a game. And no, I don't mean when you boot up the cartridge on the whole. I mean every time you die in a game and start a new game, you have to switch the game into 6-button mode by pressing the button. This just seems like an incredibly needless hassle, and I don't see why it simply is not an option in the options screen with all the rest. The other issue that I have is with how the game handles high scores. Rather than keeping the scores in-game, all of these scores are kept at a central repository that shows the status for every game on a single screen. Now, this I don't mind necessarily. I can see why you might want to have all the scores kept in one place, but the game has no battery backup, so once the game is turned off, it never happened. If they were going to be cheap and kick out bubbles due to lack of storage, the least they could do is add battery backup in its place, which would also allow initial entry. But no, that clearly was too cost prohibitive. Playing Williams Arcade's greatest hits this week was a lot more fun than I was expecting. Almost always in the 16-bit era, when you were playing an arcade port, it was going to be inferior. I mean, unless you had a Neo Geo, I suppose. So it was nice to have 5 classics represented here in near perfect quality that didn't require you to carry around a roll of quarters. Granted, I understand that these games come from the early 80s rather than the late 80s, and the Genesis should be able to fully replicate them without issue, but the developer still has to put in the work, and that doesn't always happen, especially when you're trying to make 5 things accurate and not just one. Coming out in late 1996, Williams Arcade's Greatest Hits is definitely a budget title, to be sure, but that doesn't mean it's bad, and due to the care that Digital Eclipse showed when creating this collection, I'm giving Williams Arcade's Greatest Hits 3 stars. If you're like me and you've never played some of these games, I highly recommend giving this a few hours of your time, especially for the very reasonable price copies of the game go for even today.
And that's it for Williams Arcade's Greatest Hits for the Genesis. If you happen to be a modern gamer and you haven't played the games in this collection, I'd recommend that you pick up a copy of the previously mentioned Midway Arcade Origins, which is still available on the Xbox Store as a backwards compatible title, because you'll get those 5 games, plus Bubbles, and 24 other games including classics like Gauntlet, Super Off-Road, Arch Rivals, and Smash TV, all arcade perfect. I've bought more than a few of the arcade collections that are out there for the purposes of comparing the Genesis versions on this channel, and I have invariably ended up getting distracted by other games and losing countless hours, but in a good way. Next time on the channel, it's a game that I have fond memories of as a kid, but it's also a game that I never actually beat, even though I enjoyed it. So I'm hoping that maybe this week I'll be able to dedicate some real time to it and right that wrong. And maybe also figure out why I possibly wasn't able to finish it all those years ago. Now, I've reviewed some other games based on Disney properties so far on the channel, namely Tailspin and Goofy's Hysterical History Tour, but neither of those games really got the job done. I mean, they did certain things right, but ultimately I ended up disappointed. Will Disney's third time be the charm, or is my figurative princess in another castle? Anyway, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 274. If you like what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you're so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Later.